Welcome back, children. Today we're going to be talking about elaborating upon evidence because it's something that a lot of people struggle with. Um, we're pretty good, a lot of us, at coming up with evidence, but then knowing what to say about evidence without repeating ourselves or just summarizing the evidence is something that's difficult. So today I'm going to give you some strategies for how to do that. These are required notes as usual, so make sure that you have them and you're able to show me those notes when I check for them. So the way that this can help today or in the future is with this focus point, which I'm sure we've been talking about in class, but it will remain relevant for the rest of your at least school career. And that is learning to focus and maintain a central idea in one's expository writing with a range of sufficient evidence and elaboration. And we've covered lots of ways to do that first part, the focusing and maintaining central ideas. We've covered those things in class. We haven't covered a lot about ranges of sufficient evidence and elaboration. And so today we're especially talking about elaboration here. You can see in the artwork off on the left, we've got the central idea, and then that is, evidence goes into that to make that central idea. But on top of evidence, you also need elaboration. And so that's what we're really focusing on. Remember also that everything should be leading to that central idea. Like your elaboration should give us clues to the central idea. The evidence should be in support of the central idea. So I'm going to give you a quick and dirty checklist for 3 steps to elaboration anytime you're asked to provide evidence and then explain how that evidence supports whatever your central idea is. Then you should go back to this easy little trick and see if you have done these things. So the first thing that you want to do with evidence is you want to make sure that you cover what kind of evidence we're looking at. So what I mean by what kind of evidence we're looking at, you need to be clear about what it is that we're looking at. Are we looking at a fact? Are we looking at a statistic? Are we looking at an anecdote or a memory? This is not a complete list. It could be any number of things, but you want the audience to know what we're looking at. Remember also that part of that what is your citation. You need to tell us where it came from. If it's a fact, who discovered that fact. If it's a statistic, who crunched the numbers for that statistic. If it's an anecdote, from whom does it come? And if it's a memory, it's probably from you, but that should be clear, right? And so on and so forth. Anytime you give evidence, you should be able to tell your teacher, tell whoever you're talking to where that evidence came from. So once we cover what kind of evidence we're looking at, then as part of elaboration, you also want to cover why we're looking at it, or why is the evidence relevant. And the only way that it's relevant is if, number one, it relates back to that central idea, but number two, it tells us something new about that central idea. It goes into detail about that central idea. So while it might be clear what the central idea is, it may not be clear what this piece of evidence has to do with the central idea. And so once we know what kind of evidence we're looking at, we also want to know why that evidence then relates back to the central idea, and why does it tell us something new about that central idea. The last thing that you want to do with when you're elaborating on evidence is you want to apply that evidence to the central idea or theme. So once you've told us what new thing we're learning about the central idea, then you want to apply it to our understanding of the central idea. It's easy to state this explicitly. So now we know that this relates to the central idea because, and this is how it makes our ideas more complex. What's more challenging is to imply it through our writing, right? We already know why it's telling us something new about the central idea. So if you can just imply that now we can use this evidence in a specific way when thinking about the central idea, that's going to be much more satisfying to the reader than just you saying, okay, now do this with this information when thinking about the central idea. A lot of students will get confused between the difference between why and apply. Just think, if you're struggling with that, think applying is bigger picture. What are we going to do with this information? The central idea is a lot of times something that relates to us on some level, and now that evidence should help us relate to that central idea. And I know that that's a little bit tricky. It's tricky to draw that line, but do the best that you can. My advice to you is this, that there are many ways to accomplish doing these 3 steps, telling us what kind of information we're looking at, telling us why we're looking at that information, and telling us how it applies to ourselves. You can do it just like a check, check, check. I did this, I did this, I did this, and it's fine, but it's boring. And the less bland you can be and not doing it like a checkbox, the better your writing's going to be. Let's really quickly look at an example of how an anecdote, some metaphor, and experience might show cultural beliefs, and look especially at how the evidence is elaborated on here. Here's our paragraph. Evidence of how Star Wars has become part of my teaching culture is like when Yoda shows Luke that a person's size doesn't matter by lifting an entire starship out of a swamp even though he's just a tiny man. This is an anecdote from The Empire Strikes Back that shows what I believe, that people are capable of much more than they often give themselves credit. This is important to my culture because many students in my classes just give up when something is hard. But if I show them how hard work pays off, they might be able to do more if they make it part of their culture. Now, this is fine. Does it tell us what kind of evidence we're looking at? Yeah, we know that we're looking at an anecdote for sure. The metaphor is kind of built in there. And I mentioned that I'm using experience from my own life, right? I've cited the evidence, it's fine. Do I know why we're looking at it? Yeah, I know why we're looking at it. It says this is important to my culture because. So, it's tying back to the the central idea. And have I applied it? Yeah, that very last section, if I show them how hard work pays off, yada, yada, yada. The problem is that this is, despite the fact that it's functional, it's also really boring to read. And so I bet I can accomplish the same thing in a much more interesting paragraph and draw the reader in a little bit at the same time. So if we updated it, it might look something like this. When Luke gives up on his task of lifting his starfighter from the swamp in The Empire Strikes Back, the tiny, decrepit Yoda shows him that despite his disadvantage, he can accomplish the seemingly impossible. Metaphorically, my own job in the classroom often takes a similar form. Extracting difficult tasks from students can sometimes be like wrenching that X-wing from the gurgling mud of a discouraged student's mind. But by accomplishing the unlikely, students slowly grasp that they control what they will or will not do. I'm not saying I've achieved Yoda status, but perhaps reaching for that goal is my own starfighter stuck in the mud, and when it's finally lifted free, I might truly be living up to my aspirations and taking students along in the cockpit. Now, this accomplishes the same things. I know what kind of evidence I'm looking at. I'm looking at an anecdote, I'm looking at a metaphor, I'm looking at my own experiences. I know why I'm looking at it because it's functioning as a metaphor to help me explain my cultural identity. But I also know how it applies, that I have these aspirations and that this is what I'm going for. These are the things that I believe, and hopefully other people will come along with me for the ride, right? So I've accomplished all the elaboration. But the nice thing is I've also done it in a way that's more interesting to read, that's more true to how I speak, even though I stumbled a little bit. And that's what you really want to do also, is in your elaboration, make sure that you're using that elaboration on your evidence in a way that sounds like you and draws the reader in. Now that we're done, think about this for your reflection or for your connections. What will be the hardest part of elaboration for you to accomplish and why? I'll see you and your notes soon.